Hi everybody. Today we'll be taking a look at an essay from a book by Gary Snyder. We'll be looking at this essay in a couple of different ways. One will be thinking about reading like a writer. You know that you're going to write about something. How do you read a text? We'll apply some strategies that we'll call close reading strategies to this text. We'll also think about how we can interpret a text within a critical framework or through a critical lens. In our case, that critical lens is the question of the Anthropocene. You'll note in the text itself, Gary Snyder never uses the word Anthropocene. He doesn't talk about that. But you'll probably realize that much of what he does discuss, as he writes about the origins of Taoism, Neolithic China, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, that a lot of what we've been thinking about with regard to the Anthropocene applies. So we can see this text, even though it doesn't explicitly say it's about the Anthropocene, as a text that helps us explore the question of the Anthropocene. And to get us there, we're going to do some close reading. Close reading isn't just about what's in the text, but about the information that comes with the text. What kind of text is it? When was it written? Who wrote it? Getting a real sense of where it comes from. In this case, I'm looking at the Kindle edition of the book, The Great Clod, Essays and Notes and Memoirs on Nature and History in East China, copyright 2016. You need to pay attention to this kind of stuff in order to do a good close reading. Texts are written at a particular time by particular people in particular cultural contexts, historical contexts, and you need to be able to begin to understand that as a reader, and you need to be able to convey that to your readers when you write about such texts so that things are understood in a proper context. When performing a close reading, you want to think about structure. And by structure here, I mean, how is a text related to a larger body of texts? One way to think about that is it part of a book? Is it a standalone text? Are you looking at an entire novel? Or are you looking at a chapter or an essay that is part of a larger text? In this case, we're looking at one essay that is part of a larger set of texts. It's both a chapter in this book and an essay in this collection of essays. When you're conscious of this, even if you're just looking at one chapter or one essay out of a collection, you also want to pay attention to that publication. In this case, we have this very important epigraph, which is at the beginning of the book, and it tells us where the title comes from, right? It comes from a phrase, the Great Clod, attributed to Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosopher. We talked about this last time. I'm not going to go over this too much. We'll probably return to it later. The point, however, is now you know why this essay is called what it is. Otherwise, it might be quite mysterious to you. Another aspect of structure, how is this then structured itself, this essay in particular? We see it has a title. It's a two-part title, The Great Clod, China and Nature. And we see that it has an epigraph, again, by Zhuangzi. We talked about this last time. I won't go into too much depth. We also notice, if we zoom out and look at this essay at a higher level, that it's divided into sections. Last time, we only talked about the epigraph and this first section. Today, we'll look at these other sections. This one is called Ostrich Eggs. Each section has a subtitle. The next one is called Millet, in quotation marks, Millet. The next one is called Writing and Slaves. And the next section after that, if I can get this to cooperate, is called The Way. Following that, we have a short section called The House of Life. We have a section called Salt and Iron, and that's it. So, a close reading often starts with the big picture. What is this text a part of? When was it written? Who wrote it, who are they, understanding these things. And then zooming in a little bit, how is this text structured? Can we look at it at a high level and see some element of structure? And what can we learn from that? Here we have an essay that is divided into sections, and each section has its own title. That already begins to help us interpret it. At this point in the close reading process, you should be taking notes. You should be highlighting things. In an electronic document like this, of course, you might make a note that this comes from a place. I'm going to spell Zhuangzi in pinyin, right? But you should start doing this kind of thing yourself, right? I'm doing it here this way. Now, sometimes you get documents in easy to annotate electronic form like this. Sometimes you get them in less easy to annotate form, and you have to do something to make them easy to work with. That might mean printing out an electronic document or converting it to a PDF so that you can stick comments on it. You have to figure that out yourself. The most important thing is that you develop a good means of annotating, noting on the document as you work with it, as you give it a close reading. This will help you better understand it and also begin to see what you might do with it as a writer. So, last time we gave a fairly close reading to this Zhuangzi story of the boat, and we began to think about this first section in which Gary Snyder, just 2 paragraphs, right? Now we're analyzing structure again. This introduction is 2 paragraphs long. 1 paragraph, he focuses on having grown up in Seattle, fallen in love with the mountains, and with Chinese art after a visit to the art museum. The next paragraph, he talks about a deeper engagement with Chinese poetry and how this gave him the idea that China was an ancient civilization deeply in touch with nature. And he moves through this paragraph to challenge that. And he critiques his earlier assumptions. For a time, I believed that China was this way, then I thought it was that way. But he completes his thinking here. In this first paragraph, we find that large civilized societies inevitably have a harsh effect on the natural environment, regardless of philosophical and religious values. That's where we ended last time. But I want to make some structural comments again. By seeing this opening introduction, clearly we recognize it's 2 paragraphs. There's a movement. The writer here, Gary Snyder, is beginning to make an argument. He makes a big claim here, and one that is very important, right? No matter what, he says, civilization has a harsh effect on the natural environment. Let's keep that one in mind. He also says that there's something in Chinese culture that has an idea that carries a kind of critique with it that is very harmonious with respect to the natural environment. So there's a tension here between civilization as we know it and this idea or concept or feeling or spirit that seeks to be in a kind of harmony with the natural environment. And therefore, the argument would go, is intrinsically in opposition to what we think of as civilization. That's all right in these first 2 paragraphs. And it's a strong and maybe strange idea. We tend to want to think well of civilization, and yet we can recognize that civilization, as it has developed to this very point, is also very harsh on the non-human natural environment. This is part of it. So with this approach in mind, thinking structurally, not just diving in and blindly reading and wondering what's going on and finishing it, an essay and feeling like you got a little bit of it. You see it structurally, you can keep coming back to it and see it more clearly. So we can begin reading the second section by simply analyzing its structure. Ostrich eggs, there's 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs, 4 paragraphs, a short paragraph introducing a list, 5 paragraphs, 6 paragraphs, and then the next section. So we have a 6-paragraph section called Ostrich Eggs before us. Then we can begin to move into each paragraph and begin to think about the content. We begin with this peculiar title, Ostrich Eggs. An interesting subject, right? One doesn't usually think of ostriches in regard to China. Ostriches live in, where do they live? In Africa. But we're talking about what? The late Pleistocene. This big, the late Pleistocene, and here I've made a note, 2,600 to 5,000 years ago. The end of the age is defined as 11,700 years ago, right? That's the beginning of the Holocene. So I made a note for myself when I read this to help me better understand what this writer's talking about, because I'm not deeply experienced geologist, and so the Pleistocene might be a new concept to me. I'm trying to help myself better understand it. Right? You need to do the same. Anyway, late Pleistocene was a rich time for the people of Asia. Let's stop there. Again, this writer is making an interesting move. That's an interesting claim. He's saying that before what we think of as civilization, before what we think of as our time, and this is in the cave of forgotten dream time, right? Before all of this, people in Asia were rich. That's a very interesting claim. Some of you in your writings so far in this class have used the word primitive in a kind of presumed pejorative sense. In other words, less developed, therefore less good, therefore now is better, and the future will be better still if we follow that logic of continuous progress. This first sentence already challenges that premise and further develops the argument that we see taking shape in the introduction, which opposes civilization, large-scale civilization, with a healthy natural environment. The two can't seem to be reconciled, and also proposes that there's a philosophical strain or way of thinking that manifests in art and literature that points toward a more harmonious relationship with nature. So is this that more harmonious relationship already? Once we start to perform a close reading and really think with the text, we can get to this point. To be fair, I've read this now probably a dozen times because I've taught it before. But you can do this too. And when you write about a text, this is what you should be doing. Reading it 2, 3 times, analyzing its structure, and then seeing how that structure shapes content in a way that is an argument. And when a good writer is at work, every single line, every single word contributes to that argument. None of it is wasted. And that's where we want to get you, right? To a point where you're not wasting words.